The courtroom is silent as a tiny black girl takes the stand, her hands trembling. The defendant, shackled in chains, barely lifts his gaze. Then she leans into the microphone and speaks a single word. "Daddy!" Gasps. Shouts. A woman screams. The judge's gavel slams down. Lock down this courtroom, nobody leaves. Because this isn't just shocking, it changes everything. What devastating truth is about to come to light? Stay with us, because this story is just getting started. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The heavy wooden doors of the Savannah courthouse groaned as Eleanor Hayes guided 8-year-old Malia through them. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. Eleanor's heart thumped against her ribs as she took in the scene before her. Rows of dark wooden benches filled with townspeople, their whispers creating a soft buzz that echoed off the high ceilings and ornate moldings. "Stay close to me, sweetheart," Eleanor murmured, keeping a gentle but firm grip on Malia's small hand. The child's blue dress rustled as she pressed closer to Eleanor's side, her shoulders hunched slightly against the weight of so many curious stares. At the defendant's table sat Jeremiah Davis, his broad shoulders rigid beneath the bright orange jumpsuit that seemed to scream his status as an accused man. Metal handcuffs glinted at his wrists, a harsh contrast to his dark skin, the chains making a soft clinking sound with each of his careful movements. His public defender, Mark Reynolds, shuffled through a stack of papers, his forehead creased with worry. The fluorescent lights caught the gray in his hair as he leaned over to whisper something to his client, his weathered face betraying his concern. Across the aisle, prosecutor Aaron Wilkes stood like a statue in his expensive suit, his cold blue eyes fixed on Jeremiah with predatory intensity. Eleanor had seen that look before, the look of a man who cared more about winning than finding the truth, who saw cases as stepping stones rather than lives in the balance. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom, startling several spectators. Judge Charlotte Reed swept in, her navy robes flowing behind her as she took her place at the bench, the heavy wood creaking slightly under her weight. The room fell silent except for the soft scrape of shoes as everyone stood, the tension nearly palpable in the air. "Be seated," Judge Reed commanded, her blonde hair neat and severe against her shoulders, every strand perfectly in place. She lifted her gavel, and the sharp crack made Malia jump, her small hand tightening in Eleanor's grip. Eleanor watched as Aaron Wilkes rose smoothly to his feet, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease like an actor taking center stage. His voice filled the courtroom, dripping with false concern that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the man before you today is not just any defendant. Jeremiah Davis is a convicted felon, a man with a history of violence who harbored a deep grudge against St. Matthew's Baptist Church." Jeremiah's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek, but he kept his eyes forward, his expression carefully neutral despite the prosecutor's verbal assault. Eleanor felt her stomach twist as Wilkes continued his character assassination, each word carefully chosen to paint the darkest possible picture. "The evidence will show that Mr. Davis deliberately set fire to this house of worship, destroying not just a building, but the heart of our community. This was an act of revenge, pure and simple," Wilkes declared, his voice ringing with manufactured righteousness. Beside Eleanor, Malia's fingers twisted together in her lap, her small face pinched with worry. Something about her nervousness seemed different, more urgent than simple courtroom jitters. She kept glancing between her father and the prosecutor, her dark eyes holding a knowledge that made Eleanor's heart skip. The jury members glanced at Jeremiah, their faces already hardening with judgment, already seeing the monster Wilkes wanted them to see. Mark Reynolds shifted in his chair, his objections weak and infrequent as Wilkes hammered home point after damaging point about Jeremiah's past, each word another nail in what felt like an inevitable coffin. Judge Reed watched the proceedings with careful neutrality, but Eleanor caught a flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, in her eyes as Wilkes strutted before the jury box with overwhelming confidence, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor with each deliberate step. "The prosecution calls James Morton, fire investigator, to the stand," Wilkes announced, his satisfaction barely concealed. A middle-aged man in a crisp uniform approached the witness stand, his badge catching the light. After being sworn in, he began his testimony with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times before. The fire was definitely set intentionally. We found traces of accelerant at multiple points of origin, and Mr. Davis was seen in the vicinity just hours before the blaze began, he stated, his words falling like heavy stones in the quiet courtroom. Eleanor felt her heart sink to her stomach. She leaned down to whisper, her voice barely audible. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Malia gave a quick nod, but her eyes remained locked on Jeremiah, her gaze intense and unwavering. As if sensing her presence, he slowly lifted his head. Their eyes met across the courtroom, father and daughter, and in that moment something electric passed between them, a connection that no amount of chains or legal proceedings could sever. The courtroom clock ticked past 10:30 a.m. as Prosecutor Aaron Wilkes strode confidently to the center of the room. His polished shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, each step measured and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Fire Chief Raymond Carter sat in the witness box, his broad shoulders filling out his crisp uniform, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The creases in his uniform were sharp enough to cut paper, a testament to his attention to detail. "Chief Carter?" Wilkes began, his voice carrying through the hushed courtroom like a knife through butter. "Please tell us about the night of the fire." The fire chief leaned forward, his weathered face serious, decades of experience etched into the lines around his eyes. "We received the call at approximately 11:45 p.m. When we arrived at St. Matthew's Baptist Church, flames were already visible through the windows. The heat was intense enough to crack the stained glass." Eleanor watched as Wilkes paced methodically before the jury. He moved like a conductor, orchestrating every moment for maximum impact. His perfectly pressed suit a stark contrast to Jeremiah's borrowed blazer. "And what did your investigation reveal about the fire's origin?" Wilkes asked, his tone deceptively casual. "We found clear evidence of accelerant use, specifically gasoline. It had been poured inside the church, creating a deliberate path for the flames to follow. The pattern was unmistakable, something we rarely see in accidental fires." The jurors scribbled frantically in their notepads, their faces growing grave with each detail. Eleanor felt her stomach twist into painful knots as she glanced at Jeremiah, who sat motionless at the defense table, his jaw clenched tight. "Chief Carter," Wilkes continued, savoring each word, "did you or any of your team notice anything suspicious that night?" The fire chief shifted in his seat, his pause lasting just a beat too long, the wooden chair creaking beneath his weight. "Yes. Jeremiah Davis was seen running away from the church." Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom like a sudden gust of wind. Eleanor's heart plummeted as she heard the whispers start, spreading like wildfire through the gallery. Next to her, Malia's small body went completely still, her breathing shallow and quick. Judge Reed tapped her gavel once. "Order," she commanded, her voice firm but not harsh, like a teacher quieting an unruly classroom. Wilkes walked to the evidence table with measured steps, lifting a clear plastic bag containing a rusty gas can. The metal was scratched and dented, telling its own silent story. "Chief Carter, can you identify this item?" "Yes, that's the gas container we found approximately 50 yards from the church, hidden beneath some bushes." "And what did your forensics team discover on this container?" "We found multiple fingerprints matching those of the defendant, Jeremiah Davis. The prints were clear and recent." Eleanor watched the jury's reactions like a hawk watching its nest. Their expressions hardened as they stared at the evidence, then at Jeremiah. His large hands were clenched into fists on the defense table, knuckles white with tension, but his face remained carefully blank, a mask he'd perfected during his time behind bars. The morning dragged on like a heavy weight being pulled uphill as Wilkes methodically built his case. When Officer Daniel Hopkins took the stand, his police uniform pristine and his posture rigid as a telephone pole, Eleanor felt the noose tightening around Jeremiah's neck. "Officer Hopkins," Wilkes began, adjusting his tie with practiced precision, "please tell the court about your previous encounters with the defendant." "I've had several interactions with Mr. Davis over the years," Hopkins stated matter-of-factly, his badge catching the light. Multiple disturbance calls, a few arrests for minor offenses. He's been a familiar face at the station. Eleanor saw Jeremiah's broad shoulders tense at the mention of his past, like a man bracing for a blow. She glanced down at Malia, whose small hands were now balled into tight fists in her lap, her knuckles as white as her father's. The child's eyes never left her father, even as Officer Hopkins continued to list every mistake Jeremiah had ever made, each transgression another nail in his coffin. The evidence mounted like a wall being built brick by brick, each piece making Jeremiah look more guilty than the last. Eleanor felt helpless as she watched the case unfold, the morning's hope crumbling under the weight of Wilkes's relentless prosecution, like sand castles washing away in an incoming tide. The clock on the courthouse wall showed 11:15 a.m. as Mark Reynolds dabbed at his forehead with a wrinkled handkerchief, his hand trembling slightly. The morning's testimony had been brutal, each witness hammering another nail into Jeremiah's coffin, their words echoing with devastating clarity. He glanced at his client, but Jeremiah's face remained as unreadable as a stone wall, his eyes fixed straight ahead, jaw clenched tight against whatever emotions churned beneath the surface. Eleanor watched Malia from her seat in the gallery, noting how the little girl kept shifting in her chair, her small fingers twisting the fabric of her blue dress until the cotton wrinkled beneath her anxious touch. There was something in her eyes, a desperate need to speak, to say something important, but her lips remained tightly sealed, quivering with unspoken words. Mark shuffled through his papers, the rustle of documents seeming unnaturally loud in the tense courtroom. He knew his defense was crumbling like sand through his fingers. The physical evidence, the witness testimonies, Jeremiah's past, it all painted a damning picture that seemed impossible to overcome. He needed something dramatic, something to shake up the prosecution's seemingly airtight case before it was too late. Taking a deep breath that did little to steady his nerves, Mark stood. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call an unexpected witness." He paused, his voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in his chest. "We'd like to call Malia Davis to the stand." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers, the sound like leaves rustling in a sudden wind. Several jurors straightened in their seats, their attention suddenly razor-sharp, exchanging meaningful glances. Judge Reed's eyebrows drew together as she looked down at the defense attorney, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "Mr. Reynolds, are you certain about this?" Her voice carried a note of concern, tinged with maternal protectiveness. "Yes, Your Honor, this witness is crucial to our case." Judge Reed considered for a moment, then nodded slowly, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light. "Very well, proceed." Eleanor felt her stomach twist into knots as she looked at Malia, her heart aching for the child beside her. The little girl's eyes had gone wide as saucers, and her breathing had quickened to shallow pants. Was this the right decision? Should she stop this? But something in her heart told her Malia needed this chance, needed to speak her truth. "It's okay, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, giving Malia's hand a gentle squeeze that conveyed all the love and support she could muster. "You can do this." Malia stood on shaky legs and made her way to the front of the courtroom, her Mary Jane shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. The bailiff had to bring over a special cushion so she could see over the witness stand, the worn blue fabric a stark contrast to the dark wood. Her tiny frame looked even smaller against the massive wooden chair, her feet dangling well above the floor like a doll's. Judge Reed watched the child intently, her expression softening slightly at the sight of such innocence in her imposing courtroom. Across the room, Prosecutor Wilkes's face had darkened like storm clouds gathering, his eyes narrowing as he studied the unexpected witness. He leaned forward in his chair, like a cat preparing to pounce, his manicured fingers drumming silently on the table. The silence in the courtroom grew thick and heavy as Malia's small hands wrapped around the microphone, her knuckles white with tension. The sound of the air conditioning humming overhead seemed deafening in the quiet, a mechanical heartbeat counting the seconds. Mark approached the witness stand carefully, his movements slow and deliberate, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Hello, Malia?" Thank you for being here today." His voice was gentle, grandfatherly, warm with understanding. "I just have one simple question for you. Do you recognize the man sitting there?" He gestured toward Jeremiah, who seemed to hold his breath. Malia's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. Her eyes locked with Jeremiah's across the courtroom, father and daughter connected by an invisible thread of shared pain and hope. And for a moment, time seemed to stand still, the world holding its breath for her answer. The courthouse clock ticked to 11:30 a.m., each second stretching like molasses as the crowd held its collective breath. Eleanor's heart thundered against her ribs so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Her hands trembled as she watched Malia, perched like a tiny bird on the witness stand, her small feet barely touching the footrest below. Prosecutor Wilkes leaned back in his chair, a dismissive smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd seen desperate defense tactics before, and this one, putting a child on the stand, seemed particularly pathetic. His fingers drummed lazily on the prosecution table as he waited for this farce to end, his expensive suit jacket unbuttoned in a show of casual confidence. Judge Reed's stern expression softened slightly as she watched the little girl. She adjusted her reading glasses and leaned forward, her elbows resting on her desk, the dark wood polished to a mirror shine. The child's discomfort was evident, but there was something else in her demeanor, a determination that seemed to radiate from her small frame, lighting up her eyes with quiet strength. Malia's hands shook as they gripped the microphone, her knuckles white with tension. Her blue dress rustled softly as she shifted in the oversized chair, the fabric catching the morning light streaming through the tall windows. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier with each passing moment, pressing down on everyone present like a physical weight, broken only by the occasional cough or shuffling of papers. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, Malia leaned toward the microphone, her breath fogging the metal mesh. The single word that escaped her lips changed everything. Daddy. The courtroom erupted. The quiet tension exploded into chaos as people jumped to their feet, wooden chairs scraping against the floor. Gasps and shouts echoed off the high ceiling, bouncing between the marble columns. A lawyer at the prosecution table dropped his pen, the metal clicking against the wooden floor and rolling away unnoticed, leaving a trail of blue ink in its wake. From somewhere in the back, a woman's scream pierced through the cacophony of voices. "Oh my God!" The cry seemed to trigger even more commotion, like a match thrown into dry kindling. Judge Reed's gavel crashed down again and again, the sharp crack of wood on wood competing with the din. "Order! Order in this court!" Her voice carried authority, but the chaos continued to spread like wildfire through the packed gallery. Eleanor rushed forward, maternal instincts taking over, her heels clicking against the floor. She wrapped her arms around Malia, pulling the little girl close against her chest. She could feel Malia's heart racing, matching her own frantic rhythm, the child's tears dampening her blouse. At the defendant's table, Jeremiah Davis slowly raised his head. The mask of indifference he'd worn all morning cracked and fell away like shattered glass. His eyes went wide, darting between Malia and the chaos unfolding around them. The chains at his wrists clinked softly as his hands trembled, tears welling in his eyes. Prosecutor Wilkes stood frozen, his face drained of all color, looking like a statue carved from chalk. The confident predator was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he'd seen a ghost. His perfectly organized notes lay scattered across the table, forgotten, pages floating to the floor like autumn leaves. Judge Reed rose to her full height, her black robes billowing as she stood, her voice cutting through the pandemonium like a knife. "Lock down this courtroom," she commanded, her words echoing off the walls. "Nobody leaves." The heavy oak doors slammed shut with a thunderous boom that silenced the room, making several people jump. The sound of multiple locks clicking into place seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment, each metallic snap like a punctuation mark. Everything had changed, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The heavy oak door of Judge Reed's chambers clicked shut behind her as she paced across the Persian rug, her judicial robe swishing with each determined step. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across her desk piled high with manila folders and well-worn legal texts. She pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to ease the growing tension headache that had been building since the morning's unexpected revelations. Outside, the muffled sounds of chaos still echoed through the courthouse walls like distant thunder. Security guards stood firm at their posts, keeping everyone contained as ordered, their faces set with professional determination. Judge Reed paused at her window, watching a growing crowd of reporters gathering on the courthouse steps below, their cameras flashing like lightning in the morning light. "This was supposed to be straightforward," she muttered, picking up the case file labeled State versus Davis. Her eyes scanned the preliminary reports again, looking for something she might have missed, some detail that could explain how things had spiraled so dramatically out of control. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter!" she called out, straightening her posture and smoothing her robe. Her clerk stepped in looking flustered, his tie askew and forehead beaded with sweat. "Your Honor, the courtroom is still in upheaval. The prosecution is demanding immediate action, and the gallery won't settle down." Judge Reed nodded curtly. "Tell them I'm calling a brief recess." She gathered her composure and returned to the courtroom, her shoulders squared against the weight of responsibility. The scene before her was tense, crackling with raw emotion. Eleanor sat rigid in her seat, arms wrapped protectively around Malia, who buried her face in Eleanor's soft blue blouse, small shoulders trembling. Jeremiah remained at the defense table, his shackled hands gripping the edge so hard his knuckles had turned white, the metal chains clinking softly. His eyes never left his daughter, filled with a mixture of longing and disbelief. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Wilkes approached the bench, his usual confidence now tinged with barely controlled anger, his perfectly pressed suit at odds with his reddening face. "This is clearly a desperate ploy by the defense. The child's testimony is completely irrelevant to the arson charges. We can't allow this emotional manipulation to derail justice." Mark Reynolds stepped forward, his tie loosened and face flushed with indignation. "Irrelevant? A child just revealed she's the defendant's daughter. This case just changed, Your Honor. Everything we thought we knew needs to be reevaluated." Judge Reed studied both attorneys carefully, noting their tense postures and defensive stances. Neither seemed to grasp the full weight of what was unfolding before them, too caught up in their legal battle to see the human drama playing out. She raised her hand for silence, commanding attention without speaking a word. "This court will take a temporary recess," she announced, her voice carrying across the room with quiet authority. "However, let me be clear. This courthouse remains in lockdown until we get to the bottom of this situation. No one leaves, no one enters without authorization." From his seat, Jeremiah's voice cracked through the tension like breaking glass. "Malia. Baby girl." The words came out rough, barely above a whisper, heavy with years of separation and regret. Malia lifted her tear-streaked face from Eleanor's embrace, her wide eyes finding her father's across the room. But before she could move, court officers stepped between them, following standard protocol. Their presence created a physical barrier that seemed to mirror the years of separation between father and daughter. Judge Reed gestured to her bailiff, a seasoned officer who understood the delicacy of the situation. "Please escort Ms. Hayes and the child to conference room B. Post officers at the door. No one enters without my explicit permission." She watched as Eleanor guided Malia through a side door, away from the growing crowd of spectators trying to catch a glimpse of them, the older woman's arm steady around the child's shoulders. Settling back into her chair, Judge Reed surveyed the courtroom with sharp eyes that missed nothing. The morning's events played through her mind on repeat like a film stuck on loop. The seemingly solid case against Jeremiah Davis had cracked wide open, revealing something darker beneath the surface, something that made her judicial instincts tingle with warning. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the stack of evidence files before her, wondering what other secrets they might contain. Eleanor held Malia close in the small waiting room, feeling the child's heart beating against her chest like a frightened bird. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the institutional gray walls. Outside, they could hear muffled footsteps in the hallway and the occasional crackle of the court officer's radio. The faint scent of lemon cleaner hung in the air, a stark reminder of the sterile environment surrounding them. "Sweetheart," Eleanor said softly, running her fingers through Malia's dark curls, her touch gentle and reassuring. "How long have you known?" "About Jeremiah being your father." Malia's fingers twisted in the fabric of her blue dress, the cotton material wrinkling beneath her nervous grip. She stayed quiet for so long that Eleanor wondered if she would answer at all. Finally, in a whisper so faint Eleanor had to lean in to hear it, Malia said, "Always." The simple word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor's heart ached, thinking of all the times Malia must have carried this knowledge alone, a burden too heavy for such small shoulders. Meanwhile, in her chambers, Judge Charlotte Reed spread out Jeremiah's case files across her mahogany desk, the wood polished to a warm gleam beneath the scattered papers. Her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she examined document after document, her practiced eyes scanning each page with careful attention. Something caught her eye, a sealed file tucked between court orders. The edges were worn, as if someone had handled it frequently, the corners soft and creased from repeated viewing. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Mark Reynolds, the defense attorney, entered with slumped shoulders and loosened tie, his usually neat appearance betraying the strain of the case. "Your Honor," he said, his voice tight with urgency, his fingers drumming nervously against his thigh. "We need to talk. There's something strange about this case." Judge Reed gestured to the chair across from her desk, noting the unusual tension in his demeanor. "Go on." "I've been reviewing Jeremiah's history," Reynolds continued, pulling out his own stack of papers, the sheets rustling in his trembling hands. Before the fire, he was turning his life around. Had a solid construction job lined up with Henderson Building Company. Good references, everything. The supervisor there spoke highly of his work ethic. He paused, shuffling through the documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. But here's what's odd. 3 years ago, he filed for custody of Malia. The petition was rejected without cause. No hearing, no investigation, just denied. That's not normal procedure. Someone wanted this buried. Judge Reed's brow furrowed as she examined the rejection notice, holding it up to the light. The signature at the bottom was smudged, nearly illegible, as if deliberately obscured. In his office down the hall, Aaron Wilkes paced back and forth, his expensive shoes wearing a path in the carpet. His hand shook slightly as he held his phone to his ear, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. "We have a problem," he muttered, glancing nervously at his closed door, his free hand tugging at his collar. "This girl is going to unravel everything. She wasn't supposed to be here." On the other end of the line, silence stretched for several seconds before a shadowy figure shifted in their chair, listening intently to Wilkes's words, the weight of unspoken threats hanging heavy in the air. Back in her chambers, Judge Reed stood up, smoothing her robe with practiced hands. Her face was set with determination as she gathered the files, each document another piece of a puzzle she was beginning to see more clearly. The bailiff appeared at her door, standing at attention. "Your Honor, the courtroom is ready." She nodded, but for the first time since the trial began, doubt crept into her mind, settling like a cold weight in her chest. As she walked toward her courtroom, the weight of the files in her hands felt heavier than usual, laden with secrets waiting to be revealed. The afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The old building seemed to hold its breath as the clock struck 3:30 p.m., and the gallery filled once again with spectators, their whispers creating a low hum of anticipation. Jeremiah Davis sat at the defendant's table, his posture noticeably different from the morning session. Gone was the defeated slump of his shoulders that had made him look smaller, older. Now he sat upright, his eyes fixed on Malia, who had returned to her seat beside Eleanor, her small face full of trust and worry. Eleanor watched Aaron Wilkes like a hawk, noting every twitch and gesture. The prosecutor's earlier confidence had cracked, revealing tiny fissures of uncertainty in his normally composed demeanor. He shuffled papers on his desk, his movements jerky and agitated like a man trying to rebuild a house of cards in a growing wind. Mark Reynolds, the defense attorney, straightened his tie and called his next witness. The defense calls Henry Lawson to the stand. A tall man with graying hair and deep laugh lines around his eyes made his way to the witness stand. His firefighter's uniform was pressed and neat, badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights, but his weathered face showed the strain of decades fighting fires and witnessing human tragedy. After being sworn in, Henry settled into the chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. "Mr. Lawson," Reynolds began, his voice calm and measured, "you were present the night of the church fire, correct?" "Yes, sir, I was one of the first responders on scene. Can you tell us what you saw?" Henry's eyes darted briefly to Wilkes before returning to Reynolds. He took a deep breath, his shoulders squaring as if preparing to lift a heavy weight. Someone was seen running into the burning church that night, not away from it. The flames were already reaching through the roof when we arrived. The courtroom exploded with gasps and exclamations, the tension crackling like electricity. Judge Reed's gavel cracked against the wooden block 3 times, demanding order, the sharp sound echoing off the high ceiling. Wilkes shot to his feet so quickly his chair scraped against the floor, his face flushed crimson. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. No physical evidence supports this claim." He practically spat the words. Before Judge Reed could rule, Henry's voice cut through the chaos, steady and clear as a bell. "We thought the man was trying to escape, but now, I don't think he was running away. I think he was running in to save someone. I've seen that kind of bravery before, the desperate kind that makes a person run toward danger instead of away from it." The jury members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from certainty to confusion like clouds changing shape. One woman in the front row leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration, pen hovering over her notepad. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, each beat echoing in her ears. She reached for Malia's hand, squeezing it gently, feeling the child's small fingers wrap trustingly around her own. This testimony changed everything. The entire narrative Wilkes had constructed was crumbling like ash in the wind. Judge Reed leaned forward on her bench, her eyes sharp with interest beneath her wire-rimmed glasses. Her pen hovered over her notepad, forgotten as she studied Henry's face, searching for any sign of deception and finding none. Wilkes stood at his table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge, his carefully maintained facade cracking. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple despite the cool air conditioning, betraying his growing desperation. At the defense table, Jeremiah's hands slowly clenched into fists, the tendons standing out against his skin. His eyes, which had been dull with resignation all morning, now held something new, a flicker of hope, small but unmistakable, like the first spark of dawn breaking through darkness. The truth was finally emerging, one testimony at a time. The courthouse emptied slowly as the day's proceedings came to an end. Eleanor guided Malia through the crowded hallways, keeping a protective arm around the child's shoulders. The little girl hadn't spoken since her testimony, her small face drawn with worry. People bustled past them, their voices echoing off the marble walls, but Eleanor kept Malia close, shielding her from the chaos. The drive home was silent except for the soft hum of the car engine. Malia pressed her forehead against the passenger window, watching the familiar streets of Savannah slip by. Her breath left little clouds of fog on the glass. Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, dancing from the old oak trees that lined their route home. At home, Eleanor went through their usual bedtime routine, helping Malia change into her favorite pink pajamas and brush her teeth. But tonight was different. The usual comfort of their routine felt hollow, weighted down by the day's events. When Eleanor tried to tuck her in, Malia's small hands gripped Eleanor's sleeve, her fingers twisting in the fabric. What if they take him away forever? Malia's voice was barely above a whisper, her dark eyes wide with fear. A tear rolled down her cheek, catching the soft light from her bedside lamp. Eleanor's heart clenched. She sat on the edge of the bed, drawing Malia close. The child's question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. What could she say? She couldn't make promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Instead, she held Malia tighter, stroking her hair until the little girl's shoulders stopped shaking. After Malia finally drifted off to sleep, Eleanor headed to her study. Sleep felt impossible. Her mind raced with too many questions, too many fears. She pulled out boxes of old files she'd kept from her teaching days, along with newspaper clippings she'd collected since Jeremiah's arrest. There had to be something she was missing, some detail that would make sense of it all. Article after article mentioned Charles Whitmore, the wealthy land developer who'd been trying to buy up property in the historic district. His name appeared too often to be coincidence. Eleanor's hands trembled as she found an old newspaper from 3 years ago, its pages yellowed at the edges. The headline read, "Local Man Protests Whitmore Development Project." The photo showed Jeremiah, younger and less weary, standing with other community members outside the church. They held signs protesting the demolition of historic buildings in their neighborhood. His face was set with determination, his stance proud and unbending. Eleanor's breath caught as another memory surfaced. She remembered hearing whispers about Whitmore's involvement when Jeremiah's custody petition for Malia had been denied. It hadn't made sense then. Why would a powerful developer care about a father's custody case? The question had nagged at her, but she dismissed it as coincidence. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that made her stomach turn. The sharp ring of her house phone cut through the silence, making her jump. She stared at it, heart pounding against her ribs. Who would call this late? The old-fashioned phone seemed to grow louder with each ring, demanding an answer. After 3 rings, she reached for the receiver with trembling fingers. "Hello?" Nothing but silence answered her. Then came a voice, deep and raspy, like gravel being crushed. "Stay out of this." The line went dead with a sharp click, leaving Eleanor alone with the quiet hum of the dial tone. Eleanor's hand shook as she lowered the phone. The warning was clear. She'd stumbled onto something dangerous, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Her gaze drifted to the ceiling, toward where Malia slept peacefully upstairs, and her resolve hardened. Whatever the risk, she couldn't back down now. Not when Jeremiah's freedom and Malia's future hung in the balance. The morning sun cast long, golden shadows across Eleanor's cozy kitchen floor as she sat hunched over at her small, worn wooden table, surrounded by a scattered array of papers and newspaper clippings. Her once steaming cup of coffee had gone cold, forgotten as she pored intently over the research she had gathered the night before. The unsettling memory of the anonymous phone call still echoed in her mind, making her shoulders tense with worry. Soft, padding footsteps soon drew Eleanor's attention, and she looked up to see Malia, the young girl she had come to cherish, appearing in the doorway in her pink pajamas, her hair slightly tousled from sleep. Malia's eyes, wise beyond her years, quickly took in Eleanor's tired face and the mess of documents covering the table. "You're worried," Malia observed gently, climbing onto the chair next to Eleanor's. Eleanor tried to offer the girl a reassuring smile, reaching out to tenderly smooth Malia's unruly hair. "Just doing some reading, sweetheart," she said, but her voice lacked its usual warmth, and even the perceptive child could tell that something was deeply troubling her. Making a swift decision, Eleanor stood up from the table, grabbing her worn beige coat from the hook by the door. She quickly called upon Mrs. Peterson, the kind neighbor next door, to watch over Malia, then headed determinedly to her car, her mind racing with purpose. Thomas Greer, a once respected journalist in the town of Savannah, lived in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of the city. The paint was peeling, and the overgrown garden gave the home an air of neglect, but Eleanor knew better than to judge a book by its cover. Thomas had been one of the most admired reporters in the area before his retirement. When the door opened, Thomas appeared, his white hair uncombed and his clothes wrinkled, a look of surprise crossing his weathered features. "Eleanor?" he exclaimed, his bushy eyebrows rising. "What brings you here?" Inside the cluttered living room, Thomas settled into his favorite armchair, looking visibly uncomfortable. "You don't want to dig too deep, Eleanor," he warned, fidgeting nervously with his reading glasses. But when Eleanor mentioned the name Charles Whitmore, something shifted in Thomas's demeanor. The friendly, retired journalist disappeared, replaced by a harder, more serious individual. His eyes darted to the windows before he spoke, his voice low and cautious. "Whitmore's been trying to get that church land for years," Thomas revealed. "He wants to build some fancy shopping complex. The congregation wouldn't sell, no matter how much money he offered." He paused, reaching for an old file folder. Then suddenly there's a convenient fire and your friend Jeremiah gets blamed. The investigation was rushed through faster than I've ever seen. Eleanor's heart pounded as Thomas pulled out yellowed newspaper clippings, the headlines jumping out at her. Local business owner mysteriously disappears after land dispute. Family loses everything in suspicious circumstances. Whitmore's got a pattern, Thomas explained, spreading the articles across his coffee table. Anyone who stands in his way either loses everything or vanishes. Jeremiah must have known something he shouldn't have, made him the perfect scapegoat. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the damning articles, the similarities undeniable. Before she left, Thomas caught her arm, his face grave. "If you keep digging, you won't be safe. Whitmore doesn't play fair." The drive home felt longer than usual, and Eleanor gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just learned. The fire wasn't an act of revenge. It was calculated, planned, and Jeremiah was being framed. But time was running out. If she didn't act quickly, an innocent man would take the fall for someone else's carefully orchestrated crime. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped her steering wheel, pulling into her driveway. The morning sun felt too bright, too exposing, like a spotlight she couldn't escape. She rushed from her car to the front door, fumbling with her keys before getting inside, nearly dropping them twice. The click of the lock behind her provided little comfort, echoing in the quiet entryway. Through the kitchen doorway, she saw Malia at the table, colored pencils scattered around her as she drew quietly. Bits of paper shavings dotted the wooden surface like confetti. The little girl looked up, her dark eyes instantly reading the worry on Eleanor's face, her small fingers tightening around the pencil she held. "Everything okay?" Malia asked softly, setting down her blue pencil. A half-finished drawing of what looked like a butterfly lay before her. Before Eleanor could answer, a sharp knock at the door made her jump, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet house. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the front door cautiously, each step measured and hesitant. Through the peephole, she saw nothing. Just an empty porch, bathed in morning light. Eleanor's stomach churned as she opened the door slowly, checking both ways. The street appeared normal, peaceful even, with birds chirping in the maple trees and a neighbor's wind chimes tinkling in the distance. But then her eyes fell on her car. All 4 tires were slashed, the rubber torn and mangled like some animal had attacked them. A white piece of paper fluttered against her windshield, held in place by a windshield wiper, dancing in the morning breeze. Eleanor's legs felt weak, almost rubbery, as she walked to her car. With shaking fingers, she plucked the note free, the paper crinkling in her grip. "Stay out of it." The words written in bold black marker seemed to scream from the page, the ink still looking fresh and glossy. Eleanor spun around, scanning the quiet street, her heart pounding in her ears. Empty porches, still gardens, closed windows. But somewhere, someone was watching. She could feel eyes on her, making her skin crawl. She hurried back inside, double-checking the lock, then triple-checking it. Her fingers fumbled with her phone as she dialed the police, missing the numbers twice before getting it right. While waiting, she peeked through the curtains every few minutes, jumping at small sounds. A car door closing down the street, a dog barking, the house settling. Deputy Frank Coleman arrived 20 minutes later, his patrol car crawling up the street like he had all the time in the world, tires crunching lazily on the asphalt. He barely glanced at the tires, scratching notes in a small pad with obvious disinterest, his pen moving so slowly it seemed deliberate. "Could be kids messing around," he said, shrugging his shoulders, his whole demeanor dismissive. His badge caught the sunlight as he shifted his weight, flashing like a warning. "Happens more often than you'd think." "Kids?" Eleanor's voice cracked with disbelief, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "Who leave threatening notes?" The deputy's eyes didn't even meet hers as he closed his notepad with a snap. "We'll look into it, ma'am." His tone suggested otherwise. Inside, Malia had abandoned her drawing and stood in the hallway, her small frame tense with worry, her butterfly picture forgotten. As Deputy Coleman's car disappeared down the street, She walked to Eleanor and wrapped her arms around her waist, pressing her face into the soft fabric. "They don't want you helping Daddy," she whispered into Eleanor's sweater, her voice muffled but clear. Eleanor knelt down, pulling Malia into a proper hug, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. The child's warmth steadied her racing heart, anchoring her. "I'm not stopping, sweetheart." She held Malia tighter, drawing strength from her presence. Moving through the house methodically, Eleanor checked every window, testing each lock twice, her fingers pressing against the metal until they ached. She pulled all the curtains closed, casting the rooms in shadow, turning their sunny home into a fortress. In the kitchen, she wedged a wooden spoon into the sliding door track, an old teacher's trick she'd learned years ago during a school safety workshop. The house felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in, the shadows deeper than usual. But Eleanor stood straight, her jaw set with determination, her spine steel rigid. She wouldn't let them scare her away, not when Jeremiah's freedom and Malia's future hung in the balance. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on for both of them. The fluorescent lights of Oakwood Nursing Home buzzed softly overhead as Eleanor walked down the sterile hallway, the antiseptic smell burning her nostrils. Her sensible shoes squeaked against the polished floor, each step echoing her nervousness like a drumbeat in the quiet corridor. Room 214. Margaret Fisher's door stood slightly ajar, a slice of afternoon sunlight spilling into the hallway. "Come in, child," a thin voice called before Eleanor could knock. Margaret Fisher sat in a worn armchair by the window, her silver hair neatly braided, her dark hands folded in her lap like weathered autumn leaves. Despite her age, her eyes remained sharp and alert, carrying wisdom earned through decades of life. "Mrs. Fisher," Eleanor said softly, taking the chair opposite her. The cushion sagged beneath her weight, speaking of countless visitors before her. "Thank you for seeing me." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the ceramic teapot on the small table between them, its blue and white pattern faded with age. "You take sugar?" she asked, pouring carefully, the amber liquid streaming steadily into the cup. "Yes, please." Eleanor watched as Margaret dropped a sugar cube into the delicate teacup, the small white cube dissolving slowly. "I need to ask you about the fire at St. Matthew's." The spoon Margaret was holding clinked against the cup, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Her whole body seemed to stiffen, like a startled deer. "Some things," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "are better left alone." Eleanor leaned forward, the chair creaking beneath her. "Please, a man's life depends on this." Margaret stared out the window for a long moment, watching leaves dance in the autumn breeze. Finally, she spoke, her voice shaking like those same leaves. "It started weeks before. Men I didn't recognize hanging around after services, taking pictures, making notes. They tried to be subtle, but I've lived too long not to notice such things." She paused to sip her tea, gathering her thoughts. Then Jeremiah came one night. He was scared, really scared. Not the kind of fear you see in movies, but real terror in his eyes. Said something bad was coming, told me I needed to be careful. Eleanor's heart began to pound against her ribs. "What happened next?" "Got a phone call. Man with a fancy voice told me to leave town for a while. Said it would be safer." Margaret's hands clutched her teacup tightly, her knuckles growing pale with the pressure. "I didn't listen, I'm too old to run." "The night of the fire," Eleanor prompted gently, trying to keep her voice steady. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes, catching the afternoon light. "I was in the church late, practicing hymns. Jeremiah burst in, yelling about smoke. He ... Her voice broke. "He carried me out. The smoke was so thick I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. If he hadn't come..." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue from her sleeve. Eleanor pulled out her phone, hitting record. "Mrs. Fisher, would you be willing to say that again, for the record?" Margaret nodded slowly, straightening her shoulders. She repeated her story, her voice growing stronger with each word, like a flower turning toward the sun. When she finished, she grabbed Eleanor's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You have to understand, Jeremiah Davis saved my life that night. He's no arsonist. He tried to stop it. "Why didn't you come forward before?" "Fear," Margaret whispered, her eyes darting to the window. "Charles Whitmore. He owns half this town. His reach is long." She squeezed Eleanor's hand. "Please be careful. That man doesn't like loose ends." Eleanor stood, tucking her phone away carefully in her purse. "Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. This will help." Outside, the parking lot seemed too quiet, too empty, like a held breath. Eleanor scanned the area carefully before approaching her car, her keys clutched tightly in her hand. A dark sedan sat at the far end of the lot, its windows tinted black as night. She couldn't see if anyone was inside, but the hair on the back of her neck stood up. Her hands shook slightly as she got into her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly enough to turn her knuckles white. The afternoon sun filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she settled into her usual spot in the gallery. The recording device felt heavy in her purse. Margaret's words could change everything. Prosecutor Aaron Wilkes strode into the courtroom, his usual swagger noticeably diminished. His tie was slightly crooked, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. He shuffled his papers, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "Your Honor," Mark Reynolds stood, his voice stronger than it had been all week. "The defense would like to present new evidence that calls into question the prosecution's entire narrative." Wilkes jumped to his feet. "Objection. Any last-minute evidence should have been disclosed during discovery." Judge Reed's sharp gaze fixed on both attorneys. "Mr. Reynolds, explain yourself." "If my client is guilty, then why was he seen running into the fire? Why was a key witness warned to leave town?" Reynolds' words hung in the air like smoke. The jury stirred, several members leaning forward. One woman frowned, scribbling furiously in her notepad. "Objection!" Wilkes's voice cracked slightly. "This is pure speculation without supporting evidence." "Overruled," Judge Reed said firmly. "But Mr. Reynolds, I expect you to substantiate these claims." Eleanor watched Wilkes closely. His fingers drummed nervously on the table, his jaw clenched tight. Gone was the predatory confidence from earlier. Now he looked like prey, sensing a trap. Judge Reed adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Reynolds, if you have additional evidence to present, now would be the time." Eleanor's fingers closed around her purse strap. Margaret's testimony could expose everything: the threats, the conspiracy, Jeremiah's true role that night. She started to rise from her seat. A court officer approached quietly, bending down beside her. "Ma'am, there's someone outside asking for you. They say it's urgent." Eleanor hesitated, glancing at the recording in her purse. Carefully, she stood and made her way to the hallway, her steps measured and deliberate. A tall man in an expensive black suit stood by the entrance, his dark sunglasses reflecting the fluorescent lights. His presence seemed to make the air colder. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his voice low and menacing, "you're making dangerous choices. Turn around before it's too late." Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting his hidden gaze. "I'm not turning around." A cold smile curved his lips. "Then you won't like what happens next." Without another word, he turned and walked away, melting into the crowd of reporters and spectators. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hand steady despite the threat. She had come too far to back down now. The evening air grew chilly as Eleanor stood outside the courthouse, her fingers wrapped tightly around her purse strap. The recording inside felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. People streamed past her, heading home after another long day of testimony, but she remained fixed in place, watching the courthouse doors. When Aaron Wilkes emerged, his usual confident stride was replaced by something more hesitant. He kept adjusting his tie, looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped directly into his path. "We need to talk," she said firmly, her voice steadier than she felt. Wilkes barely glanced at her. "I'm late for a meeting." He tried to step around her, but Eleanor moved with him. "You knew," she said, loud enough that a few passing lawyers turned their heads. "You knew Jeremiah was innocent." His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching near his temple. "Drop it, Eleanor. Go home. But Eleanor stood her ground, her heart pounding. Margaret Fisher was warned to leave town before the fire. Jeremiah was seen running into that church, not away from it. The church was always the target, wasn't it? And Charles Whitmore stood to gain everything. Wilkes's eyes darted around the courthouse steps, checking for eavesdroppers. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You don't understand what you're getting into. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. With trembling fingers, she pressed play. Margaret's frail voice filled the space between them. Jeremiah tried to warn us. He knew something bad was coming. The color drained from Wilkes's face. Where did you get that? Who are you protecting? Eleanor pressed, taking a step closer. Who ordered you to go after Jeremiah? Something in Wilkes snapped. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in. You're playing with fire, Eleanor. Walk away before you get burned. Eleanor yanked her arm free. I'm taking this to Judge Reed. Wilkes leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. If you do, you won't be the only one paying the price. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Eleanor watched him stride away, her heart hammering against her ribs. The exchange confirmed her worst fears. Wilkes was just a puppet. Someone else was pulling the strings, someone with enough power to make a prosecutor ignore justice. She turned toward the parking lot, her mind already racing with what to do next. But then she stopped cold. Her car door stood open, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. Through the window, she could see Malia's empty booster seat. Her daughter was gone. Eleanor's living room felt like it was closing in on her as she paced back and forth, her cell phone clutched so tightly her fingers ached. The blue and red lights from police cruisers outside cast eerie shadows through the windows, making everything feel surreal. 3 uniformed officers methodically moved through her house, checking windows and doors, taking pictures, looking for any sign of how someone had taken Malia. Ma'am, Detective Briggs said softly, his deep voice steady and calm. I need you to walk me through everything again. He stood by the window, his broad shoulders blocking out some of the flashing lights. His dark eyes watched her carefully, filled with concern. Eleanor's voice trembled as she spoke. She was right here when I left for the courthouse, right here on this couch, watching her favorite cartoon show. Mrs. Peterson from next door was supposed to check on her every hour. Tears welled up in her eyes. She was safe. She was supposed to be safe. Briggs nodded slowly, jotting notes in his small notebook. And you're certain about the timing? Yes, Eleanor whispered, sinking into her armchair. I called at 4 to check on her. She was fine then. Everything was fine. The detective's face remained serious as he processed the information. Could someone be targeting her because of what's happening in court? Because of her connection to the trial? Eleanor's heart seemed to stop for a moment. She knew the answer, but saying it out loud made it real. Yes, she managed. They've been threatening me, warning me to stop digging. One of the officers called out from the kitchen. Detective, we found something. Briggs excused himself, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts. The silence was deafening until her phone suddenly rang, making her jump. Unknown number. Her hands shook as she answered it. At first, there was nothing but breathing on the other end, slow, deliberate breaths that made her skin crawl. Then came the voice, distorted and mechanical. Stop, or you'll never see her again. Eleanor's entire body went cold. Please, she begged, her voice barely a whisper. Please don't hurt her. She's just a child. The only response was a click followed by silence. Detective Briggs returned just as Eleanor's phone slipped from her trembling fingers. He took one look at her face and knew something was wrong. Ms. Hayes, what happened? They called, she said, her voice hollow. They said I'll never see her again if I don't stop. Briggs immediately signaled to another officer. We need a trace on that call now. He turned back to Eleanor, his expression grim but determined. We're going to find her, Ms. Hayes, but I need to know everything. Every detail about these threats, about the case, about what you've discovered. Through the window, Eleanor watched as more police cars arrived. An officer was interviewing Mrs. Peterson, who kept wringing her hands and shaking her head. Another neighbor mentioned seeing a black SUV parked across the street earlier, a vehicle no one recognized. Eleanor gripped her phone, her knuckles white with tension. This wasn't just about threats anymore. This wasn't just about warnings or intimidation. They had taken Malia, an innocent child, to silence her. The weight of that reality pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. The abandoned house loomed before them like a dark shadow against the star-filled sky. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe, her fingers gripping the car door handle. Every second felt like torture, knowing Malia was somewhere inside that decrepit building. Judge Reed sat beside her in the unmarked police car, her usual composed demeanor cracking. Her face looked pale in the dim light, and she kept checking her phone, waiting for updates from Detective Briggs. "We need to go in now," Eleanor whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "Every minute we wait." Judge Reed shook her head, her eyes fixed on the house. "If this is Whitmore, we're up against more than just corruption." She turned to Eleanor, her expression grave. "These people, they don't play by any rules." A crackle came through on the radio. Briggs' voice was low but clear. "Location confirmed. Moving in." The police team moved like shadows, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Eleanor watched, her chest tight as they surrounded the house. The sound of the front door being breached made her jump. Inside, the air was thick with dust and abandonment. Cobwebs hung from corners, and their footsteps echoed on the rotting floorboards. Eleanor followed close behind the officers, her heart stopping at every creak and groan of the old house. Then, a sound. A whimper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the garage. Eleanor rushed forward, nearly stumbling in her haste. There, in the darkness, sat an old pickup truck. In the back seat, tied up but alive, was Malia. "Baby!" Eleanor cried out, her hands shaking as she reached for the door handle. Officers helped her get Malia out, and Eleanor's fingers worked frantically at the ropes binding her small wrists. "I'm here, baby, I've got you," Eleanor whispered, pulling Malia into her arms. The little girl buried her face in Eleanor's neck, her whole body trembling. Detective Briggs moved through the garage, his flashlight beams sweeping methodically. "Got something," he called out, holding up a cheap burner phone from behind some old boxes. "This was planned, all right." Outside, they found the black SUV that had been spotted near Eleanor's house earlier. It sat empty, its dark windows reflecting the police lights. Malia wouldn't let go of Eleanor, her small fingers gripping Eleanor's shirt. "They said you'd stop looking if I was gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eleanor held her tighter, anger and determination burning in her chest. "They were wrong," she said firmly, looking at Detective Briggs. "We take this to court. Now." The night air felt colder somehow as they stood there, surrounded by police activity, the abandoned house standing as a silent witness to what had almost been lost. But Eleanor knew this was just the beginning of their fight for justice. The soft glow of Eleanor's bedside lamp cast warm shadows across Malia's face as she tucked the little girl into bed. Her heart was still racing from the events of the night, but having Malia safe beside her helped calm her nerves. She smoothed back Malia's damp curls, noticing how exhausted the child looked. "Try to rest now, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, pulling the blanket up to Malia's chin. But Malia's small hand suddenly moved to her pocket. Eleanor watched, curious, as the little girl pulled out what looked like a digital recorder, no bigger than a pack of gum. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "What is that?" Malia's eyes were wide and serious in the dim light. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I hid it." They didn't know. Her tiny fingers trembled as she held out the device. Eleanor's hands shook as she took the recorder. With trembling fingers, she pressed play. The sound was scratchy but clear enough, and what she heard made her blood run cold. Charles Whitmore's distinctive voice filled the room. Jeremiah was supposed to take the fall. Another voice responded, and then Whitmore again. "Burn it down. No loose ends." The next words made Eleanor's heart stop. If that little girl becomes a problem, take care of it. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, horror washing over her. This wasn't just evidence, this was proof. Concrete proof of everything. Moving quickly but trying not to alarm Malia, Eleanor grabbed her phone and dialed Judge Reed's number. It took several rings before the judge answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Eleanor, do you know what time it is?" "Listen," Eleanor said, and held the phone close to the recorder as she played it again. The sleepiness vanished from Reed's voice instantly. "Where did you get this?" "Malia had it. We need Detective Briggs here now." Within minutes, arrangements were made for Briggs to come collect the recorder. Eleanor sat beside Malia's bed, watching as the little girl's eyes grew heavy. Despite everything that had happened, Malia finally drifted off to sleep, her face peaceful for the first time in days. Eleanor stayed there, keeping watch as the night slowly gave way to morning. The first hints of dawn were breaking through the window, painting the sky in soft pinks and purples. She held the recorder tightly, knowing it contained everything they needed to bring Whitmore down. The sound of approaching police sirens in the distance told her Detective Briggs was almost there. Eleanor looked down at the small device in her hand, thinking about how something so small could change everything. The morning sunlight filtered through Eleanor's kitchen curtains, casting a soft glow across the worn wooden table. She hadn't slept a wink, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the small digital recorder that held everything they needed. The weight of it felt both terrifying and hopeful in her hands. From the next room, she could hear Malia's steady breathing. The child had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep just before dawn, curled up in Eleanor's bed with her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched close. Safe. For now. But Eleanor knew better than to relax completely. She lifted her coffee mug with trembling hands, the liquid long since gone cold. Her eyes kept darting to the windows, checking for unfamiliar cars or suspicious movement. The events of the past 24 hours played on repeat in her mind. Malia's kidnapping, the rescue, and now this recording that could change everything. A sharp knock at the door made her jump, coffee sloshing over the rim of her mug. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the front door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Detective Nathan Briggs stood on her porch, his dark suit crisp in the morning light. His expression was serious but carried a hint of hope that made Eleanor's breath catch. "You called?" he said simply when she opened the door. Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she held out the recorder. "This is what we've been looking for." Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow break the fragile device. Briggs stepped inside, taking the recorder carefully. Eleanor watched his face as he listened, seeing his expression darken with each passing second of Whitmore's damning words. "This isn't just a cover-up," he said finally, his jaw tight. "It's conspiracy, and now we have him." Eleanor's phone rang, making them both start. Judge Reed's name flashed across the screen. "Get to the courthouse." Reed's voice was firm, determined. "We're resuming the trial. Today." Eleanor gripped the phone tightly, feeling strength flow through her. "We'll be there." While Briggs made arrangements to have the recording analyzed by forensic experts, Eleanor watched the morning light grow stronger. Somewhere across town, she knew Charles Whitmore was about to receive word that his carefully constructed plan was crumbling. She wasn't wrong. In his expansive office overlooking the city, Whitmore's phone buzzed with an anonymous message. His face drained of color as he read it. Within seconds, he was making a call of his own, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We need to end this today." Back at Eleanor's house, she walked quietly to her bedroom where Malia still slept. The little girl's face was peaceful, her dark curls spread across the pillow. Eleanor sat gently on the edge of the bed, touching Malia's shoulder. "It's time, sweetheart," she whispered softly. "We're going to finish this." Malia's eyes fluttered open, immediately alert and understanding in that way that still surprised Eleanor. Together, they prepared to leave for the courthouse, ready to face whatever came next. Time: 10 a.m., inside the Savannah courthouse. The morning sun streams through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. The gallery is packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with anticipation and whispered conversations. Several reporters sit in the back row, pens poised over notepads. Jeremiah Davis sits straighter at the defense table, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast against the dark wood. The chains around his wrists catch the light, but his eyes hold something new, a glimmer of hope that wasn't there before. Eleanor and Malia sit directly behind him, Malia's small hand wrapped tightly in Eleanor's. Aaron Wilkes enters through the side door, his normally confident stride now stiff and mechanical. His face is carefully blank, but his fingers fidget with his tie clip. He arranges his papers without looking up, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The bailiff's voice booms, "All rise!" Judge Charlotte Reed sweeps in, her black robe flowing behind her. The room falls silent as she takes her seat, adjusting her glasses before grabbing her gavel. The sound echoes through the hushed courtroom. Court is back in session. Mark Reynolds rises slowly from the defense table, clutching a small device in his hand. "Your Honor, we have new evidence that could change everything." His voice is steady, confident. "This recording was obtained last night." Judge Reed nods. "Proceed." The recording starts to play and Charles Whitmore's voice fills the courtroom, clear and unmistakable. Jeremiah was supposed to take the fall. The words hang in the air like smoke. Burn it down. No loose ends. Gasps ripple through the gallery. A juror's hand flies to her mouth. Another juror leans forward, straining to hear every word. When Whitmore's voice mentions taking care of Malia, several people turn to look at the little girl who buries her face in Eleanor's side. Aaron Wilkes's composure cracks. A bead of sweat rolls down his temple as he stares straight ahead, his face ashen. In the gallery, Charles Whitmore sits perfectly still, his expression cold and hard as granite, his expensive suit suddenly looking like armor. Judge Reed's eyes narrow as she studies Wilkes. "Mr. Wilkes," her voice cuts through the murmurs like a knife. "Did your office have knowledge of this?" Wilkes opens his mouth, then closes it. His hands grip the edge of the table. Reynolds seizes the moment, stepping forward. "You knew Jeremiah was innocent, didn't you?" The question hangs in the air like an accusation. The jury watches intently, several members leaning forward in their seats. One juror shakes his head slowly, disgust evident on his face. Another scribbles furiously in her notebook. Wilkes's eyes dart to Whitmore, a quick, almost imperceptible glance. But it's enough. Everyone sees it. The connection is clear. Whitmore remains motionless, his arms folded across his chest, but his jaw clenches visibly. The tension in the room is suffocating. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks. Even the reporters have stopped writing, their pens frozen mid-sentence. Finally, Wilkes pushes back from the table. His chair scrapes against the floor, the sound jarring in the silence. He looks up at Judge Reed, his face a mask of defeat. "Your Honor." His voice cracks slightly. He clears his throat and tries again. "Your Honor, I need to request an immediate sidebar." Time: 11 a.m. Judge Reed's chambers felt smaller than usual, the tension making the walls close in. Sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the polished desk. Aaron Wilkes couldn't stop moving, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor as he paced. Eleanor sat rigid in her chair, watching him unravel. Mark Reynolds leaned against the wall, his tie loosened, exhaustion evident on his face. Judge Reed's presence commanded attention from behind her desk, her fingers laced together as she waited. "I knew something wasn't right." Wilkes finally spoke, his voice cracking. "The evidence. It never quite fit." He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up. But then the pressure started. "What kind of pressure?" Judge Reed's voice was steel. Wilkes laughed bitterly. "Phone calls, threats, pictures of my kids at school." He stopped pacing, shoulders slumping. "They made it clear, either I prosecute Davis or my family would suffer." Eleanor's heart clenched. Even Wilkes had been a pawn in this game. Judge Reed stood, her robes rustling. "And Whitmore orchestrated all of this?" Wilkes just nodded, unable to meet her eyes. Back in the courtroom, the tension was electric. Every face turned as Judge Reed took her place at the bench. Jeremiah sat straight-backed, his chains clinking softly. Malia gripped Eleanor's hand so tight it hurt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Reed's voice carried clear and strong. "New evidence has come to light that fundamentally alters this case." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "We will take a brief recess for final deliberation." The gallery erupted in whispers. Jeremiah remained still as stone, but Eleanor saw his hands trembling slightly. Outside the courthouse steps, Charles Whitmore paced furiously, phone pressed to his ear. "Fix this. Now." His face was red with rage, spittle flying from his lips, but the person on the other end just hung up. Detective Briggs approached with 2 officers, warrant in hand. Whitmore saw them coming and his face drained of color. When Judge Reed returned to the bench, the courtroom fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. She adjusted her robes, took a deep breath, and spoke the words that would change everything. "The court finds the defendant not guilty." The room exploded. People jumped to their feet, shouting and crying. The bailiff moved forward, key in hand, and began removing Jeremiah's shackles. The metal clanked against the floor as they fell away. Jeremiah stood slowly, a free man for the first time in months. His eyes were wet with tears he refused to let fall. The courthouse steps blazed under the midday sun, a sea of reporters and cameras crowding the entrance. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and Jeremiah Davis stepped out, squinting at the bright light. His orange jumpsuit was gone, replaced by a simple gray suit that Mark Reynolds had brought him. His hands, free from shackles for the first time in months, trembled slightly. "Daddy," Malia's voice cut through the chaos. She broke free from Eleanor's grip, her small feet pounding against the concrete steps as she ran toward him. Jeremiah dropped to one knee, opening his arms wide. She crashed into him, her tiny body shaking with sobs. "You're really free?" "Yes, baby girl," Jeremiah whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm free." Eleanor stood back, dabbing at her eyes with the tissue. The sight of father and daughter reunited made all the fear and danger worth it. Across town, a different scene unfolded at Charles Whitmore's mansion. Police cars lined the circular driveway, their lights flashing against the pristine white columns. Detective Briggs personally led the arrest, pulling a handcuffed Whitmore through his own front door. The powerful developer's face was ashen, his usual confidence shattered. "Mr. Whitmore, did you orchestrate the church fire?" reporters shouted. "Did you try to frame Jeremiah Davis?" Whitmore kept his head down, silent for the first time in his life. At the courthouse steps, Aaron Wilkes stood before a forest of microphones. His hands gripped the podium tightly. "I failed," he admitted, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I failed as a prosecutor, and more importantly, I failed as a servant of justice. My ambition blinded me to the truth, and an innocent man nearly paid the price." Inside her chambers, Judge Charlotte Reed watched the scene unfold through her window. The weight of the past few weeks lifted from her shoulders. Justice had prevailed, even if it had taken an unexpected path to get there. Jeremiah filed his lawsuit with Mark Reynolds' help, seeking compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. The town buzzed with mixed reactions, some residents angry at the system's failure, others relieved that the truth had finally come to light. On the courthouse lawn, Jeremiah held Malia's hand tight as Eleanor joined them. Together, they walked toward Eleanor's car, leaving behind the chaos of reporters and cameras. Malia looked up at her father, her small voice barely above a whisper. "Can we go home now?" Jeremiah's face broke into a warm smile, his first genuine smile in months. "Yeah, baby, we're going home." Charles Whitmore's mansion loomed against the afternoon sky, its white columns casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawn. Inside his mahogany-paneled office, Whitmore's hand shook slightly as he lifted the crystal tumbler of whiskey to his lips. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. His tie loosened, his collar dampened with sweat. The phone's sharp ring pierced the silence. Whitmore snatched it up, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Tell me you handled it." The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then a calm voice replied, "It's over, Charles." Before Whitmore could process those words, red and blue lights flooded through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting eerie shadows across his face. His fingers tightened around the glass until his knuckles turned white. Detective Nathan Briggs strode through the double doors leading a team of officers. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Whitmore straightened in his leather chair, forcing his trademark confident smile. "You have no case," he said, voice dripping with practiced authority. Briggs didn't even blink, his steady gaze fixed on Whitmore as he spoke. "We have your voice on tape. You ordered the fire. You set up Jeremiah Davis." Whitmore's laugh was cold and hollow. "That doesn't mean anything." With deliberate slowness, Briggs pulled a thick manila folder from under his arm and tossed it onto Whitmore's pristine desk. Papers spilled out, bank statements, transaction records, signed documents. "It does when we have financial records proving you paid off the investigators." The smirk finally slipped from Whitmore's face. His eyes darted to the scattered papers, recognition dawning in his expression. Two officers stepped forward, handcuffs glinting in the flashing lights outside. "Charles Whitmore, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." The walk through his own front door felt surreal. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. Reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a deafening roar. "Mr. Whitmore, did you frame an innocent man?" His face remained expressionless, jaw clenched tight. From her parked car across the street, Judge Reed watched the scene unfold, letting out a long, slow breath. As officers guided him toward the waiting police car, Whitmore's eyes caught movement across the street. Eleanor Hayes stood there, one hand on Malia's shoulder. The little girl's gaze met his, unwavering and serene. There was no fear in those eyes, no anger, just quiet certainty. Whitmore looked away first, ducking his head as he was placed in the back of the police car. For the first time in decades, Charles Whitmore had lost control. The setting sun cast long shadows through Judge Charlotte Reed's office windows, painting the room in shades of amber and gold. She sat at her desk, surrounded by towering stacks of legal briefs and case files, a half-empty glass of water sweating onto a coaster, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, mind replaying every moment of the trial like a movie she couldn't pause. The weight of what almost happened pressed down on her shoulders. An innocent man had nearly gone to prison. A little girl had almost lost her father. All because of corruption and ambition. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She straightened in her chair, smoothing her judicial robe. "Come in." Aaron Wilkes stepped through the door, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. His sharp suit looked rumpled now, his tie slightly askew. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Why are you here?" Judge Reed's voice was cool, professional, but there was an edge to it. Wilkes lowered himself into one of the chairs facing her desk. He rubbed his forehead, looking older than he had just days ago. "I let ambition cloud my judgment," he said quietly. "You nearly let an innocent man rot in prison." Judge Reed's words cut through the air like ice. "I know." Wilkes's voice cracked slightly. "And I'll have to live with that." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, placing it carefully on her desk. His resignation letter. Judge Reed picked up the envelope, studying it for a long moment. The paper felt heavy in her hands, weighted with consequences and regret. She nodded slowly. "You should have walked away before it got this far." Wilkes stood up, straightening his jacket. He looked like he wanted to say more, but no words came. Instead, he turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. The silence in the office felt heavier now. Judge Reed leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The exhaustion of the past few days settled deep in her bones, but underneath it was a sense of relief. Justice had prevailed, even if it had taken longer than it should have. She pulled open her desk drawer and took out a fresh legal pad. The yellow paper seemed to glow in the fading sunlight. At the top, she wrote in clear, determined letters, "How to prevent wrongful convictions." The county jail loomed against the morning sky, a hulking mass of concrete and steel that had been Jeremiah's world for too long. Inside his cell, he sat perfectly still on the thin mattress, his large hands clasped tightly together. The familiar sounds of the prison, metal doors clanging, guards shouting, inmates shuffling, seemed distant now. When the guard appeared with his keys jangling, Jeremiah barely moved. "Davis, you're free." The words hung in the air like smoke, too fragile to touch. After so many months of fighting, of hoping, of praying, freedom felt like a dream he might wake up from. Slowly, Jeremiah stood. His few belongings fit into a small paper bag, some letters, a worn Bible, a photo of Malia that Eleanor had brought him. His steps echoed through the corridor as the guard let him out. Sunlight streamed through the barred windows, painting bright stripes across the floor. Jeremiah squinted against the light, his heart pounding harder with each step. Through the reinforced glass doors, he could see them waiting. Eleanor stood tall and straight, her gray-streaked hair caught in the morning breeze, and beside her, his breath caught in his throat, was Malia. His little girl shifted from foot to foot, her small hands twisting the hem of her blue dress. She looked so much bigger than he remembered, yet still so small. The heavy doors buzzed open. Jeremiah stepped out into the morning air, feeling the warmth of real sunlight on his face. For a moment, everything stood still. Then Malia made a small, choked sound, somewhere between a sob and a whimper, and broke away from Eleanor. Her feet barely seemed to touch the ground as she ran to him. Jeremiah dropped to his knees, arms opening just in time to catch her as she crashed into him. He wrapped his arms around her tiny frame, pulling her close against his chest. Her familiar scent, like sunshine and strawberry shampoo, made his eyes burn with tears. He squeezed them shut, holding her tighter, afraid to let go. Malia's small hands clutched at his shirt as she cried softly against his shoulder. Eleanor watched them, tears streaming freely down her face. When Jeremiah finally looked up at her, his eyes were red. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, voice rough with emotion. Eleanor shook her head, wiping at her cheeks. "Just take care of her." Still holding Malia's hand, Jeremiah stood and looked past the prison gates. The world stretched out before him, cars driving past, people walking dogs, trees swaying in the breeze. After years of concrete walls and metal bars, it felt overwhelming. His grip on Malia's hand tightened slightly. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, looking lost. Eleanor's smile was warm and understanding. "Start by coming home." Jeremiah nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. For the first time in years, he walked away from the prison, truly free. Sunlight streamed through Eleanor's kitchen windows, casting warm patches across the worn linoleum floor. The coffee maker hummed softly, filling the air with its rich aroma. Malia sat at the wooden table, her small fingers wrapped around colored pencils as she worked intently on her drawing. Her dark curls fell forward, partially hiding her face as she concentrated. Jeremiah stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense, arms crossed over his chest. He watched the neighborhood outside, taking in the quiet suburban street that felt so different from his prison cell. After several long moments, he turned, his voice low but determined. "I want to raise her," he said, the words coming out like a confession. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She set down her coffee mug carefully, the ceramic making a soft clink against the table. Her heart raced as she considered the implications. She sat down across from him, smoothing her hands over the tablecloth. And what happens if the courts try to take her away? Jeremiah's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. His eyes flickered to Malia before returning to Eleanor. "They can't, not now." His voice carried both determination and a hint of fear. Eleanor took a deep breath, weighing her next words carefully. "We should do this together." Jeremiah blinked, clearly caught off guard, his arms uncrossed, dropping to his sides. "You'd do that?" Eleanor smiled gently, her eyes warm with affection. "She needs stability, and I'm not going anywhere." The tension in Jeremiah's shoulders eased slightly as they discussed the details. They would fight for joint custody, create a stable home where Malia could thrive. As they talked, Malia listened quietly, her colored pencils forgotten on the table. Then, without a word, she stood up and walked over to Eleanor, her small frame pressed against Eleanor's side as she wrapped her arms around her waist. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Eleanor stroked Malia's dark curls, her touch gentle and reassuring. "You never will," she promised softly. The three of them settled around the table, sharing a simple lunch of sandwiches and fruit. Malia sat between them, her eyes bright as she looked from Eleanor to Jeremiah and back again. The kitchen felt different now, warmer, fuller. For the first time, it felt like a family. The afternoon sun filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The trial had ended, but tension still hung thick in the air like summer humidity. Jeremiah sat beside Eleanor, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His eyes kept darting to the prosecutor's table where Whitmore's expensive lawyers sat in their crisp suits, shuffling papers with practiced indifference. Malia stood quietly in the gallery, her small fingers wrapped around her worn teddy bear, a constant companion through all the difficult days. Her eyes remained focused, showing a wisdom beyond her 8 years. Mark Reynolds, looking more confident than he had throughout the entire trial, stood up and straightened his tie. "Your Honor, in light of Mr. Whitmore's arrest and pending sentencing, we'd like to request a brief recess to present new evidence." Before Judge Reed could respond, Malia stepped forward. The click of her small shoes against the floor echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. Without hesitation or fear, she walked toward the witness stand. The energy in the room shifted palpably. Even the court reporter's fingers stilled over her keyboard. Judge Reed's eyebrows rose in surprise, but something in Malia's determined expression made her nod slowly. "Proceed." Malia stood straight, her chin lifted. Her eyes found Whitmore in the gallery, and she held his gaze without flinching. The powerful businessman who had caused so much pain looked somehow smaller under the steady gaze of this child. Taking a deep breath, Malia spoke in a voice that, though small, rang clear through the hushed courtroom. "I forgive you." Those 3 words seemed to fill the entire space. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual mask of confidence cracking. The word "forgive" hung in the air, carrying more weight than any testimony or evidence presented during the trial. Jeremiah reached for his daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. Pride shone in his eyes as he looked at his brave little girl. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, knowing how monumental this moment was. Forgiving the man who had nearly destroyed their lives. It wasn't easy, but Malia had done it with grace beyond her years. Whitmore's face twisted, a mix of emotions playing across his features. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time, he looked truly humbled, unable to hide behind his wealth or power. Judge Reed leaned forward, her voice steady and clear. "The court acknowledges the bravery of Malia Davis and the power of forgiveness. Let this be a reminder that justice isn't just about laws, it's about healing." Spontaneous applause erupted throughout the courtroom. As bailiffs led Whitmore away to begin serving his sentence, Jeremiah and Malia walked out together, their steps lighter, as if the weight of the past had finally begun to lift from their shoulders. The evening sun cast a warm, golden glow through the kitchen windows of Eleanor's small house. The aroma of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies mingled with the savory smell of pot roast simmering on the stove. Malia sat at the wooden kitchen table, her small fingers wrapped around a blue crayon as she carefully drew her masterpiece, a picture of 3 smiling figures holding hands. Jeremiah stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, his tall frame casting a long shadow. He watched the peaceful scene before him, still struggling to believe it was real. His hands traced the doorframe absently, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingertips, such a different sensation from cold prison bars. Eleanor stood at the stove, stirring the pot roast. She turned, catching his distant expression. "You okay?" she asked softly, her gray-streaked auburn hair catching the evening light. Jeremiah moved slowly to the kitchen table, pulling out a chair beside Malia. He glanced down at her drawing. 3 figures, one tall with a beard, one with gray-streaked hair, and a small one in the middle. All of them smiling, all of them holding hands. His throat tightened. "I never thought I'd get to see this," he admitted quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor's face softened as she watched them. "You earned this. All of you." Malia looked up from her drawing, her eyes bright. "We're a family now, right?" The question hung in the air, full of hope and possibility. Jeremiah and Eleanor's eyes met across the kitchen, sharing a moment of understanding. "Yeah," Jeremiah said softly, reaching out to touch Malia's hand. "We are." As Eleanor brought the food to the table, Malia folded her hands in her lap. "Daddy, will you say grace?" she asked, looking at Jeremiah expectantly. Jeremiah froze for a moment. It had been years since he'd prayed. Years of anger and bitterness in prison had stripped away much of his faith. But looking at Malia's hopeful expression, he slowly clasped his hands together. "Thank you." He began hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "For second chances." Malia beamed at him, picking up her fork. "Thank you for being my daddy," she said simply, taking her first bite of dinner. Eleanor watched them from across the table, her family, finally whole. The evening light painted everything in soft gold, and Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, his shoulders relaxing. For the first time in years, real peace settled over his features. The kitchen was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator, a stark contrast to the joyful dinner they'd shared earlier. Jeremiah sat at the wooden table, his large hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of tea that had long since gone cold. His shoulders were hunched, the weight of his thoughts visible in his posture. Eleanor watched him for a moment before joining him, settling into the chair across the table. The overhead light cast soft shadows across their faces. "You've been quiet," she said gently, noting how he wouldn't meet her eyes. Jeremiah's fingers tightened around the mug. "I don't deserve this, Eleanor. I don't deserve them." His voice was rough with emotion, barely above a whisper. Eleanor's heart tightened in her chest. "What do you mean?" Pain flickered across Jeremiah's face as he finally looked up, his eyes filled with guilt. "I wasn't there when she needed me most. I failed her as a father." Each word seemed to cost him something, like he was pulling them from deep inside himself. All those years, all those birthdays, all those nights she might have needed me. Eleanor sighed softly, understanding flooding her features. She'd seen this coming, the weight of regret finally catching up with him. "Jeremiah, you're here now. That's what matters." He shook his head, his jaw tight. "But I wasn't there. And for that, I'll never forgive myself." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Eleanor reached across the table, placing her warm hand over his. The simple gesture seemed to break through something in him. "Malia doesn't need perfection, Jeremiah. She needs you. She always has." The truth of her words seemed to settle over him like a warm blanket. His eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, something inside him began to heal. He nodded slowly, accepting her words. "You're right. I just need to be the man she deserves." Rising from his chair, Jeremiah walked to the window, gazing out at the quiet night. Eleanor joined him, their shoulders nearly touching as they stood in comfortable silence. The street outside was peaceful, lit only by the soft glow of street lamps. "Thank you for giving me a chance," Jeremiah whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. Eleanor smiled, her heart full of hope for their future. "You don't need to thank me. You've earned this." The house stood silent under the moonlit sky, peaceful and still. At 2:30 a.m., only crickets could be heard chirping outside Malia's bedroom window. The little girl lay curled up in her bed, her stuffed bear clutched tightly against her chest. Suddenly, a muffled scream pierced the quiet night. The sound echoed through the hallway, sending both Eleanor and Jeremiah racing to Malia's room. They found her sitting upright in bed, her small frame shaking, her pajamas damp with sweat. Her eyes were wide with terror, darting around the room as if searching for unseen threats. Jeremiah reached her first, his strong arms wrapping around her trembling body. "It's okay, baby. It's just a dream." His voice was soft but steady, trying to anchor her back to reality. Malia buried her face in his chest, her fingers gripping his shirt so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I saw him. He was coming for us. He was going to hurt you." Her words came out between ragged breaths, tears streaming down her cheeks. Eleanor moved closer, perching on the edge of the bed. She reached out, gently stroking Malia's damp hair. "It's okay. He can't hurt us anymore." Her touch was tender, motherly, offering comfort through the simple gesture. Malia lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting Eleanor's. Her voice was barely above a whisper, fragile and afraid. "I'm scared. What if he comes back?" Jeremiah held her tighter, rocking her gently as he had when she was smaller. "I won't let anyone hurt you, baby girl. Not ever again." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, whispering words of comfort and protection. Eleanor remained by the door, watching father and daughter together. Her heart ached, knowing that the trauma wouldn't disappear overnight. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with more nightmares and fears to overcome, but they would face it together as a family. Gradually, Malia's breathing steadied. Her grip on Jeremiah's shirt loosened as exhaustion took over. Her eyes grew heavy, and eventually, she drifted back to sleep, her face peaceful once more. Jeremiah stayed perfectly still, watching his daughter sleep. His expression was a mixture of love and determination, a father's promise to protect his child. Eleanor stepped forward quietly, placing her hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this, together." Jeremiah nodded, his eyes never leaving Malia's face. For the first time since the nightmares began, he truly believed it. The morning sun cast long shadows across Savannah's streets as Eleanor pulled into the grocery store parking lot. The town was already buzzing with activity, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. News of Jeremiah's exoneration had spread quickly through the tight-knit community, leaving a visible divide in its wake. Eleanor took a deep breath before stepping out of her car. She could feel the weight of stares as she walked through the automatic doors, the fluorescent lights harsh against her tired eyes. Some shoppers nodded in support, offering small smiles of encouragement. Others turned away abruptly, their disapproval clear in the sharp way they averted their gaze. In the produce section, Eleanor carefully selected apples, trying to ignore the whispers that floated around her like autumn leaves. Two women stood near the tomatoes, their voices carrying despite their attempts at discretion. "I can't believe they let him go," one woman said, shaking her head. "A man like that should never have been freed." "They say he had a history of violence," her companion added. "What about the church?" Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she placed the apples in her cart, but she kept her head high. She knew this was part of the healing process, for both Jeremiah and the town. The store's bell chimed as Jeremiah walked in, holding Malia's small hand in his. The little girl skipped beside him, oblivious to the sudden hush that fell over the store. Shoppers turned to stare, some with cold, judging eyes, others with sympathy and understanding. Malia noticed the attention first. She tugged gently on Jeremiah's sleeve, her voice small but clear. "Daddy, why are they looking at us like that?" Jeremiah knelt down beside her, his eyes level with hers. His voice was low but firm, filled with quiet dignity. "Some people are still learning to see the truth, baby girl. But that's okay. We don't need their approval." Malia's face brightened as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "I love you, Daddy." Eleanor watched the exchange, her heart swelling with pride. She knew in her bones that Jeremiah was a good man, and she was prepared to stand beside him, regardless of what anyone else thought. As they gathered their groceries and headed toward the exit, a woman stepped forward from the checkout line. Eleanor recognized her as Sarah Mitchell, a longtime resident. Sarah's smile was hesitant, but genuine. "I heard what you did," Sarah said softly. "It wasn't easy." Eleanor nodded, accepting the olive branch for what it was. "Thank you." Jeremiah extended his hand and Sarah took it, her expression softening as she looked into his eyes. I was wrong to judge you." "It takes courage to admit that," Eleanor replied gently. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as cameras flashed and reporters jostled for position. Aaron Wilkes stood at the podium, his once pristine suit now wrinkled, his forehead glistening with sweat under the noon sun. His hands gripped the edges of the wooden stand, knuckles white with tension. Eleanor and Jeremiah approached slowly, their footsteps echoing on the stone steps. Their joined hands spoke volumes about their unity. Questions flew from the crowd like arrows. "Mr. Davis, how does it feel to be free? Ms. Hayes, what made you fight so hard?" But they remained silent, their faces calm and determined. Wilkes's eyes met Jeremiah's, and his glare held years of misplaced anger and wounded pride. The crowd fell quiet, sensing the tension between the two men. Jeremiah broke away from Eleanor and took a step toward Wilkes. His voice carried across the courthouse steps, quiet, but firm. "You lost. It's over." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Wilkes's shoulders sagged slightly, and something shifted in his expression. He glanced around at the sea of faces, then stepped forward to face Jeremiah directly. "I did what I thought was right," Wilkes admitted, his voice rougher than usual. "But I made a mistake." Jeremiah nodded slowly, maintaining his composure. "It's not about me. It's about the truth, and it's something you can never hide." The reporters erupted into action, cameras clicking frantically, voices rising over each other. Wilkes admits fault. Prosecutor acknowledges wrongful prosecution. With trembling hands, Wilkes pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, his resignation letter. He walked slowly toward the governor's office entrance, each step heavy with the weight of his choices. His career was over, but Jeremiah showed no joy in the man's downfall. Instead, his face reflected something deeper, the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that standing in truth was its own victory. Looking back at Malia and Eleanor, Jeremiah's voice softened. "We're free." Malia's face lit up with a bright smile as she reached for both their hands. "We're a family now." Jeremiah and Eleanor exchanged a gentle look, their smiles reflecting the peace that comes with finally being able to live without fear. The aroma of homemade spaghetti sauce filled Eleanor's cozy dining room, mingling with the sound of Malia's bright laughter. She sat at the table, swinging her legs as she described her day at school with animated gestures. "And then Tommy said my drawing was the best in class." Malia beamed, her eyes sparkling with pride. At the stove, Jeremiah stirred the pot carefully, tasting the sauce with a wooden spoon. His movements were hesitant at first. It had been years since he'd cooked a proper meal. But there was joy in his eyes, a contentment that seemed to radiate from within. "Needs more garlic," he muttered, reaching for the spice rack. His hands moved with growing confidence as he adjusted the seasonings. Eleanor leaned against the doorframe, taking in the scene before her. The weight of courthouse battles and late-night fears seemed to melt away as she watched father and daughter together in her kitchen. The simple domesticity of it all made her heart swell. Malia hopped up from her chair, carefully gathering plates and silverware. "Can I set the table?" she asked, already moving with purpose. "Of course, sweetheart," Eleanor smiled, watching as small hands arranged everything just so. When the food was ready and they all sat down, Malia folded her hands and looked expectantly at Jeremiah. "Daddy, will you say grace?" Jeremiah's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together. He hadn't prayed in years, not since before prison. His throat felt tight, but looking at Malia's trusting face and Eleanor's gentle smile gave him strength. "Thank you," he began softly, "for this meal, for second chances, and for the love we have." His voice grew stronger with each word, filled with genuine gratitude. Malia's eyes shone as she whispered, "Amen." The dinner that followed was peaceful, filled with easy conversation and comfortable silences. Malia told more stories about school, while Jeremiah and Eleanor exchanged knowing glances across the table. There was something different about tonight, something that felt right, like pieces finally falling into place. During a lull in the conversation, Malia looked up from her plate, her expression suddenly serious. "We're gonna be okay now, right?" Eleanor reached over, taking Malia's small hand in hers. "Yes," she said firmly, her voice full of conviction. "We're going to be okay. Always." After dinner, they settled into the living room together. The TV played softly in the background as they curled up on the couch. Jeremiah's arm rested comfortably around Eleanor's shoulders, while Malia snuggled against his side, her eyes growing heavy as she watched the movie. For the first time in years, there was no shadow hanging over them, no fear lurking at the edges of their happiness. There was only this moment, this perfect, peaceful moment of family and love and new beginnings. The morning sun filtered through the temporary stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Baptist Church, casting colorful patterns across the makeshift wooden pews. Construction scaffolding lined the walls, but the spirit of the congregation remained unshaken. Eleanor smoothed her Sunday dress as she walked through the doors, Malia's small hand clasped in hers. Beside them, Jeremiah stood tall in his freshly pressed suit, his shoulders straight and head held high for the first time in years. The familiar scent of wood and fresh paint filled the air, mixing with the sweet perfume of flower arrangements decorating the temporary altar. "Welcome home," Pastor Williams called out, extending his hand to Jeremiah. His warm smile reached his eyes as he clasped Jeremiah's hand firmly. The congregation turned to greet them, faces both familiar and new. Mrs. Johnson, the choir director, stepped forward with tears in her eyes, pulling Jeremiah into a tight embrace. "We missed you, child," she whispered. Others followed, offering handshakes and quiet words of support. Some smiled warmly, while others approached more hesitantly, but with genuine acceptance in their eyes. During the sermon, Pastor Williams spoke of hope and unity, his voice carrying through the temporary space with unwavering conviction. "Today, we celebrate not just the rebuilding of our church, but the restoration of our community," he declared. Malia sat between Eleanor and Jeremiah, her small frame pressed close to her father's side. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with pride. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," she whispered softly. Jeremiah's heart swelled as he squeezed her hand gently. "I'm proud of you too, baby girl." After the service, Eleanor shared their news with the congregation. "We're making it official," she announced, her arm around Malia. "The adoption papers are being filed tomorrow." The community embraced the announcement with joy, gathering around them with congratulations and blessings. Mr. Thompson, owner of Thompson Construction, approached Jeremiah with an extended hand. "We could use a man like you on our crew," he said firmly. "Starting Monday if you're interested." Jeremiah accepted with gratitude, knowing this was another step toward building his future. As they left the church, Malia skipped between them, her laughter echoing in the morning air. She grabbed both their hands, swinging between them with pure joy. Looking up at her parents, she smiled brightly. "Let's go home." Eleanor and Jeremiah's eyes met over Malia's head, sharing a quiet moment of understanding. For the first time in years, they truly belonged somewhere. Together, they walked down the sunlit street, their steps in perfect rhythm, united and strong, ready to embrace whatever the future held. If you enjoyed the story of Jeremiah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. If you enjoyed the story of Jeremiah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.